by integrated and strategic approaches to conflict management. We're going to debate that a little bit, but particularly we're going to look at some of the challenges and then perhaps some of the practical suggestions that organizations can take away to move more close towards it. I think one of the themes that we'll be discussing is that sometimes there's a tendency to suggest that there are very sort of straightforward and easy off the shelf solutions to these problems. I think one of the things that we're going to be discussing is that the evidence suggests that that's not necessarily the case. So first of all, I'd like to start by just having a little bit of a chat about what we mean by integrated and/or strategic approaches to conflict at work. And I'm going to start with Paul. So Paul Latreille, when we talk about these things, what do we actually mean?
Well, I think it's useful to start by thinking about what we mean by the word strategic in the first instance, and before we think about what that might mean in this context. And I think one way of defining it is that it's a plan of action to achieve a long-term or overall aim, or indeed aims. And so in the context of conflict at work or HR more broadly, that aim might be about dealing with conflict more effectively. If you're going a bit broader than that, as I say, wider HR, you might be thinking about effecting culture change to try and improve employee engagement or more collaborative ways of working. But really it's about pursuing a long-term aim. In terms of conflict, a strategic approach might entail being proactive rather than reactive, about looking in a broader way beyond simply looking at how to resolve the conflict once it's running.
Yeah.
So it's moving beyond the transactional to something which is about achieving a long-term objective. And Richard kind of used the terms strategic and kind of integrated conflict management systems separately. I think the two are often seen synonymously, although there's no reason why necessarily they should. The literature on integrated conflict management systems certainly is very much focused on the United States, which tends to adopt a lead in this area. And really a way of defining an integrated conflict management system is that it's, to quote Lisa Lynch, it's a comprehensive systems approach to the prevention, management and resolution of conflict, changing the philosophy and in many cases the terminology of organizational life. And there are kind of a range of elements to that, but really the key bits are it's about prevention, about early intervention, management of disputes and resolution. And I would, as an economist, add tack on the end, it's also about evaluation. But I think important to emphasize that resolution of conflict is only one element of a more strategic approach. It's not the objective in and of itself, it's part of a broader picture. So that's really what I think we mean by those two things.
Yeah.
So I just emphasise that the ICMS, the Integrated Conflict Management Systems, have got much more traction in places like the US than they have elsewhere. We might perhaps think a little bit about why that might be later on.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think one of the issues that we come across all the time when we have these discussions is about the fact that quite often, particularly when we talk to practitioners and we talk to managers, they tend to conceptualize conflict as something that's happened that then needs to be resolved, rather than developing these sort of more preventative approaches. If I can come to you, Denise, I mean, I've just wondered whether you've got anything to add to what Paul said in terms of just trying to set out the background around what we're talking about when we use terms like integrated and strategic in relation to conflict management.
Yeah, I think Paul's made a very good point there that you know, you can adopt strategic approaches to conflict management, but not necessarily, they don't have to be these integrated conflict management systems, and it is important to make that distinction. I think if we look at, you know, the strategic approach, we need to acknowledge how conflict management is linked with the competitive strategies of the firm as well. You know, how can we justify, I suppose, our approach to conflict, to enable the competitive and market strategies. And like any other HR, you know, practice that needs to be strategic, needs to be linked to that vertical kind of strategy, to organizational strategy, and as well linked to the horizontal, horizontally to other HR practices. But I think we'll probably follow up on this discussion, is this Big Bang approach about developing this conflict management strategy, whether that's through integrated conflict management systems, isn't necessarily the approach in reality. And I think what we'll talk about, and what I'd be interested in talk about, is the patterns of how a more integrated or a more strategic approach to conflict management could be established in a firm. And certainly in my research, we identified different patterns of incrementalism and taking a more strategic orientation, being, you know, appreciative of the strategic elements of that, but not necessarily this Big Bang approach to changing the overall established conflict management approach in the organisation. So certainly, I think there's lots of probably debate at the minute about what we mean by this element of strategic approach. So yeah, I'll certainly follow up on that as we go. Fantastic.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we will get to is some of those different patterns, hopefully, but also a general point is this idea that these approaches come in very many different forms, and I think we're certainly seeing that in different sectors in the UK, where when you look at what they're doing, they're probably all trying to do similar-ish things, but different organizations maybe have different keys to unlocking that door a little bit. If I could come to Gill Dix, and I know that Acas have been developing their work on this, you know, in recent years, and I'm just wondering what you see as being the potential, you know, why is Acas so interested in this idea of conflict management perhaps as opposed to, you know, what we might have traditionally referred to as dispute resolution? Jill, what's your take on that?
Well, I think it's really interesting and good news, the changing conversation we would have been having a decade ago, when I just read Lipsky and Currie and thought we need to get into this holistic approach to conflict, and how Paul and Denise, and I know yourself, have kind of got a more realistic view of what it might mean in this country. I think we have an approach in Acas that we've developed, and it's about developing our services. And it's what we call end-to-end conflict resolution. And for Acas, that means working with organisations around the preventative agenda, looking at what can be done early on in building the right relationships, through to supporting organisations through formal procedures. And in Acas, obviously, the end point is litigation as well, because we've got a statutory duty in relation to the tribunals. So I think it might be helpful for some of the audience to think about the end-to-end approach. There's a couple of features about it that I think are really important that relate to this integrated conflict approach. One is the consciousness of it for employers, being conscious about looking at the whole picture. And second is, as you've mentioned, the preventative, the resolution dimension and the learning dimension are all equally valid points. And I think, like others, we can unpack some of this a bit later on. But one thing that I do feel about this conscious approach and building a framework in organisations is it maybe no longer feels like a nice to have. And I feel it particularly with the uncertainty that organisations are facing at the moment, and how some of the uncertainties we've experienced over the last few years have become realities, and how all aspects of life have got potential to spin into the workplace, and now many aspects have got potential for conflict as well. So I think it's absolutely timely that we're moving towards a warmer description of strategic conflict management than maybe what we first read at the beginning a decade ago.
And I think you know, a lot of the work that we've been involved with, and obviously that Acas have been involved with as well, has sort of suggested there is more interest in this stuff. I think if we'd have done this webinar, you know, 7 or 8 years ago, we'd probably have very little pickup at all. There are more people talking about things like workplace mediation. There are more people talking about different types of alternative dispute resolution and different ways of trying to different approaches to conflict issues in the workplace. So, for example, in the NHS, you know, a big thing at the moment is the idea of sort of, you know, just and restorative cultures, the work that's been done by people like Merseycare. So there's lots of different approaches. If I can come back to Paul just for a second, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because we've already sort of started to say there are different ways of doing this, But you mentioned these integrated conflict management systems, and some of you who may have been with us on our very first event that we did for Propel, we had two leading US scholars, Ryan Lamar and Ariel Avgar, came and were very interestingly talked us through some of the US experiences on this. But it might be useful, Paul, if you could just outline what are some of the sort of the key ingredients of these more integrated and strategic approaches which have been developed, come out of the States, etc. Well, what's the some of the things that we look for?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there are 5 essentially. So the first one is that the system is all-encompassing. So it covers the full range of potential issues, from discipline and grievance or rights-based disputes at one end of the spectrum, through to much looser, if you like, interpersonal issues, which have their basis in different interests. So it covers the full range of potential issues, and it covers all employees. So that's the first. The second is that there are multiple access points. So individuals can enter from various routes. So it might be HR, occupational health, wellbeing, or employee assistance program. It can come via manager referral, union rep, or indeed self-referral. And you can enter at various stages in a situation and perhaps switch backwards and forwards between formal processes and informal processes. So you can go in and out of different parts of a dispute. Third thing is that there are options and choice. And I think, we've kind of hinted at this earlier, that they include multiple flexible approaches to conflict. So it's not just about, say, mediation, which tends to be the one that most people think of when they're thinking of alternative dispute resolution, but it includes a whole range of rights-based and interest-based approaches. So discipline and grievance processes. You might have mediation, arbitration, you might have an open door policy by your managers, you might have conflict coaching, so you're working with individuals to help them hone their skills. So a whole range of different kind of options and choices that individuals can select from among. And I guess you can see here that, we talked a bit more, Richard hinted earlier about one size not necessarily fitting all, and different organisations adopting different approaches, and you can see that there's a kind of range of choices there that organisations can select from, and if they're in an organisation, that the individuals within that organisation can select from. So fourth element is there are fostering and supporting elements. So high levels of corporate commitment, including financial and time and staffing resources, and visible senior leadership support, I think is absolutely key. Structures which support implementation and trust, and that includes things like incentives. So redesigning or redeveloping some of the rights-based approaches so that they make explicit mention of these other options. Perhaps having some sort of data monitoring process to pick up areas where there are hotspots around conflict or absence in the workplace, which might be indicative of wider problems. Training and skills-based programs, skills-building programs and coaching, particularly for line managers. I think there's a widespread recognition in the HR community that line managers often lack the skills and the confidence in dealing with some of these interpersonal issues. And so I think, making sure that managers have the right skill set is absolutely key. And indeed making that part of, making that a core competence in selection and promotion processes. And then the fifth element, final element, is a focus on developing a so-called conflict competent culture. That is a culture where individuals feel that they're able to raise issues, they're able to surface conflict, confident that it's going to be dealt with in a respectful way, and that they can do it in an environment of safety. I think that's a recognition that conflict can be positive. It's not always a negative thing. So it can be functional as well as dysfunctional if it's appropriately and proactively managed. So those are the 5 key elements that we can think
Fantastic.
of that integrated conflict management systems having.
That's really helpful. You've managed to distill that down really in a really concise way, which I think is really helpful. One thing I'd just like to draw attention to is that within that, you mentioned that there is that idea of having both rights-based and interest-based. So rights-based disciplinary procedures, as we know them, grievance procedures, but also interest-based, so mediation, etc. And again, that's very relevant because a lot of the debate that we've had on some of these webinars, particularly within the HR community, is around sort of, and I'm being slightly facetious here, but sort of, you know, burning our procedures and sort of like moving to something, you know, getting rid of the word grievance, for example. So that might be something we come back to later, because I think it's quite interesting what those approaches don't necessarily mean getting away completely from some of our more conventional procedures, but we'll perhaps get back to that. Denise, I know you've done a lot of work on this, and with some of your colleagues such as Bill Roach and Paul Teague. You've done quite a lot of work in terms of what the different approaches are to developing, trying to get towards some of these approaches. And you mentioned, you know, you sounded a cautious note about the idea of integrated conflict management systems, as Paul's just described. So I just wondered whether you have any thoughts in terms of what your research has shown in terms of how organizations tend to develop these or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, so I think I'd said, you know, there's this assumption almost that integrated conflict management systems are initiated in this big bang approach where you're developing this all-encompassing system that looks at all these different options and so on. But actually, you know, that obviously requires a big investment of effort, time, and can be costly. And essentially, I suppose from the perspective of employers and from HR managers, the question is, are they convinced that there is the need to actually, you know, invest in that effort? So there sometimes there's this a bit of antipathy really about conflict in an organization, and whether it actually should be considered a strategic HR function. Is there a business case really for developing these new systems? You know, so there needs to be a rationale, I suppose, that's driving this journey towards a more strategic approach. And I think, you know, what we're seeing, rather than taking a big bang approach, taking a much more incremental approach by experimentation and improvisation. Firstly, maybe introducing, you know, improvisation such as mediation in response to particular events or particular issues that crop up. And then potentially learning from those and seeing, okay, well, this made a difference, and then looking at how they can incrementally embed it into other policies and procedures, and then potentially then taking a much more strategic approach, developing into that more integrated system. And I think it's that journey that's really, really important to highlight for anyone considering these issues in an organisation. And we'll certainly talk about all the different challenges around that. But essentially, that's what we found in our research, is that the premise of integrated conflict management systems in Ireland, anyway, that's where our research was based, was there was very little evidence of that. And even those more strategic models, you wouldn't necessarily tick all the boxes for that prescriptive integrated conflict management system, but you have to acknowledge that they are strategic. They are trying to develop different innovations and practices that will help with the strategic objectives of the organisation, whether that's around, you know, labour market positioning for, you know, an employer of choice and or whatnot, or but it's so it's important to appreciate that level of strategic orientation, regardless of whether it is an integrated conflict management system.
And do you think the reason why organisations perhaps do move to use that more incremental approach, and again, I think that's something that certainly that I've noticed, is that allows them to make a case to what are often very skeptical organisational leaders who, when they hear the word conflict, sort of tend to run a mile? Is that a way of sort of, like, for example, introducing a mediation scheme, evaluating it, demonstrating its worth, and therefore saying we can improve this by building these other elements around it?
Yeah, certainly, and I would agree, you know, particularly in the way organisations are going towards, you know, purpose, mission and values of an organisation, that there's almost a reluctance to acknowledge that conflict is an issue in an organisation, and rather, you know, so it's a step probably to, you know, create that greater conversation about conflict and how to deal with it. Alongside, you know, other employee engagement initiatives and those more positive elements of trying to align people to work together more cooperatively. But yeah, so the staged and journey, the incremental steps, certainly we find help to instigate that conversation at the organizational level, and to try to get further and further buy-in from senior managers and other stakeholders in the organisation.
Okay, if I can move on to Gill, and we've got a couple of questions already in the chat. Please put some questions there, comments, and I'm going to pick those up as we go through. From an Acas perspective, Gill, what do you see the main benefits, moving away maybe from this sort of restrictive notion of integrated conflict management systems, but what are the main benefits that you would see for organizations in being more integrated, or being a little bit more strategic, or starting that journey, if you like?
Yeah, okay. Just before I sort of answer that, I think it'd be really good at some point, Richard, if you can chip in with whether you think organizations get stuck on mediation, because you're the one out there doing quite a lot of field work. And I think that's a really interesting point, that it feels, I hate the phrase low-hanging fruit, but it does feel like something that people reach for quite quickly. But to go to your question, Paul's given a really nice definition of strategic, but I'm a bit strategicked out. So, or else sometimes strategic sounds a little bit boardroom. So if that does feel the case, I think you can use other words like comprehensive and holistic. And I use the word conscious in describing this umbrella thing. And I think what it does is offer bandwidth to organizations with flexibility. That seems to me potentially to be what the value of this sort of approach is, so that you've got the bandwidth for understanding the different nature of conflict and the genesis of different forms of conflict, serious to less serious. And we've talked a little bit about allowing a reactive as well as a proactive approach. We've talked about interest, rights. We've not talked about power-based options, but that tends to be in the zone of collectivism and collective conflict, I think. And it's interesting that the debate tends to be dominated by individualized conflict, and where can we take this, the lessons, into collective. The integrated word for me actually just is about what I think the literature calls the loop back. So allowing people not to get stuck, allowing people to be able to fluidly go. I'm not saying this happens, but the idea, allowing people to be able to go between different options in the kind of conflict resolution journey, so to speak. I think the tendency to see it as a linear process is potentially quite undermining of what reality of conflict is about, and the escalation of conflict. But we have got some great new evidence. I think Peter's on the phone, on the call, Peter Irwin, and yourself, Richard, looking at the cost of a whole story on conflict, and how we've seen how conflict as it escalates gets more pricey. So, you know, I don't know if people have seen the report, but maybe put it in the box, the chat thing.
Yeah, we'll try and do that.
You know, the overall cost of 28.5 billion to organisations of conflict. The interesting bit is how the informal stage is not costly, relatively speaking. The piece where people are improving their practices, where it gets more costly is around formal stages. And that is the lion's share of that is less to do with handling a process, a procedure, and more to do with loss of the relationship and absence, resignations and absence. That's the big shock for me in that piece of work, how much money is actually spent on losing people, or people not being present and productive, and so on. So there's that. Then you've got a relatively high cost on litigation as well, but that's not as high, and that's a reflection of not many people can bring themselves to go to that stage. So, but I think understanding strategic involves not understanding the linear process and costs. But I think a strategic approach that was built around cost purely would be a disaster. I think it would do exactly the opposite, which would be about investing in just one step. And much better to think about the broader take on what strategy means. And I'm particularly keen on understanding the outcomes of different resolution processes.
Yeah.
Whether they're open to everyone, whether they're inclusive, whether they make some people feel more likely to shy away and bury the problem or resign, whether they offer fairness, whether they offer a route into improved well-being. So I think the escalation story is really helpful. I think the bandwidth thing is good, but let's not get too distracted by the costs if we're designing solutions.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. And just coming back on your point on mediation, I think that our last webinar, we talked a lot about, there is a problem, I think, sometimes with organizations thinking that mediation is the panacea, as opposed to the foundation and one part. And this is where I do think this systems approach is a useful way of thinking about it, when mediation is one part of something, as opposed to being just the, the be all and end all. I was going to get on to talk about the challenges. We've had a couple of useful questions, which were questions I was going to ask. So I'm going to see whether those individuals want to pipe up and pose them directly. Caroline Giles. Caroline, are you out there? Do you want to just pose the point that you wanted to ask or make directly, rather than me doing it?
Oh, I am here. Yeah.
Hiya.
Hiya. I agree wholeheartedly in the whole integrated and strategic or comprehensive way that we look at conflict, and I also agree with the fact that we need to open up that conversation completely. My concern, and I feel like a bit of a broken record because I'm pretty sure I've said this before, and so have others, is actually moving that conversation to the place where it's most likely to happen, and that's the first line manager. And I've got too many years experience to count, but I feel like we are constantly trying to pick up that skill level and support managers in understanding that we can't give them a rule book that says when somebody says X, you have to say Y, because that's what they're looking for. Because actually, as soon as you're talking about an interpersonal relationship at work, that rule book goes out of the window, because actually it's all about that skill set and being able to hold conversations in a sensible way that hopefully will either reduce conflict if it's already there, or prevent it from happening in the first place. And I think for me, it's about we can do all sorts of fantastic stuff at a different level in the organisation, but actually it's what happens on the ground at the first line manager level that has the real impact.
Fantastic. Anybody like to come in on that? I think it's a really critical issue, which I could talk about for days, unfortunately. Anyone? Hi, Denise.
Unless Mark wants to pipe up there.
Sorry, Denise. Yes, thanks, Richard. It's just to say, I was about to put into the chat box. The Labour Relations Agency here in Northern Ireland operate a free of charge 8-week certificate in effective line management, which looks at all of the sort of the core skills around conflict management, from informal discussions, alternative dispute resolution, procedures around discipline and grievance, and really everything in between. And that's a sort of a learning pathway that we've developed based on some of our best good practice seminars that we've run over the years. So we've refocused away from the information approach to a much more skills-based approach. And whilst I agree with everything that's been said around the virtual room today, I think the key issue is about giving those, like Caroline's point about giving those line managers, those frontline supervisors, those inherent skills about being able to spot the warning signs of conflict, how to diffuse low-level grievances, to dispel the myth that mediation is the panacea, because a lot of public sector organisations in Northern Ireland have gone down that route to say, we've got a mediation stage, that's the solution. I mean, that's been proven. Trade unions have backed away from that in Northern Ireland, questioning the independence of in-house mediators now and stuff like that. So there's a greater cultural piece to be done at that level, where what you run the risk of losing in the strategic analysis of all of this. So that was really the point that I wanted to make.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point. And what one thing that springs to my mind from that, and I'll come back to you in a second, Denise, is the fact that one of the challenges or barriers that I see is that that some of the HR community has developed this sort of strategic narrative, and I completely understand why, and that conflict seems to be outside that. And one thing that the conversations when I have with HR practitioners is that building that conflict management capacity amongst line managers is one of the most strategic things that HR can do. And actually, even if you go back to sort of some of the people who I disagree with a bit, but people like Dave Ulrich, that is part building that infrastructure in organizations is seen as being part of strategic HR, but it seems to have been forgotten a little bit. It's seen as being something that is done by employee relations a bit. So I mean that the work that you and your colleagues are doing in Northern Ireland, Mark, sounds fascinating. Denise, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, it just struck me that there was a key case study example that we studied as part of our research on Intel, who had quite a long time ago developed a new open door policy to allow employees to go to employment relations specialists who were widely regarded and had a great reputation in the organisation to resolve their issues and problems, and they were resolved and people were happy. But actually what happened was that the line managers, what we would say, would almost abdicated their responsibility. So they an issue would come and they'd be like, no, just go to the open door policy. And in effect then Intel totally transformed that policy, and then because it wasn't effective, they realized it was really important to maintain that more informal approach to conflict management. So although they tried to innovate and take on some of the principles of integrated conflict management systems, they reverted back to ensuring a more informal approach, and the key element of that was line managers. Yeah.
Gill, you've got your hand up there. Do you want to come in on this?
I think it's almost a given around the line management role now. The research has demonstrated the importance of it. I don't think it is the only factor. I think there's a lot of other factors, but maybe we're going to talk about them in a minute. We've got the LRA, we've got popular courses. I'd say the most popular course though reinforces the whole problem, which is it's around discipline and grievance handling. So whether the design of the line management training is fit for purpose, we also run having difficult conversations, and again another really popular course for Acas. I think there's still a lot to learn about how we train line managers in this, and obviously this is a cue, Richard, and to talk about the Propel Hub project. So we're in a vicious circle. I don't know, presumably you've got lots of people on the phone will be aware of the work that you're doing under the Propel Hub and the SRC involving Acas. Online management training. Yeah,
so quick plug, myself, Paul and others are involved in it at the moment in a research project where we're developing online training for line managers, and we're trying to assess the impact of that, and that's showing some really interesting things at the moment about some of the barriers. Caroline, do you want to come back just briefly?
Yeah, I'll be as brief as I can. I guess my question was to Mark, what had happened in terms of any feedback and shift in behaviour at the end of that course, and whether actually I agree wholeheartedly, but have you actually seen genuine changes in behaviour, and have you had an opportunity to evaluate?
Yeah, we have.
It's really my question.
Yeah, we have, Carolyn. We go back to evaluate, and primarily it's to assess whether or not there's been a cultural change within the organisation, or at least within the department that the line manager came from. And it's really about providing we do it in terms of assessing whether or not the individual feels that they're confident enough to address this. And it's back to the point that Denise made. We see this as it is standard issue for line managers and first line supervisors to not see these skills as being part of their remit. They see themselves as being operationally focused, and they have a particular role to carry out. They don't see themselves as having a decentralized ER type function. Yeah. And what the line manager certificate is predicated upon is actually putting that back on the agenda and saying, no, this is an integral part of your job. And
that's why we don't have an HR department.
Yeah.
So I'm head of ops, but I'm an HR professional.
Yeah, but I mean, that is a cultural discussion we've been having in Northern Ireland for decades about this, and it just depends on, very unique factors in organizations about like who's the driver behind it, whether it has that buy-in, and the points that Paul was making earlier on. All of these are relevant. So we see some really good examples of where it works really, really well, and we see some horrendous examples where people are just transactional in nature, and it's really the default system of discipline and grievance, and it, a lot of it is predicated on procedural correctness and keeping yourself right, and there's an overly defensive practices in a linear approach to conflict management, because there is sometimes a culture where people will effectively think worst case scenario, i.e. tribunal, think tribunal first and work your way back, and that is a challenge.
Paul, do you want to come in? I see you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, I was just going to add, and I think, corroborate what Mark was saying there. I mean, Richard and I did some work a few years ago with Northumbria Healthcare NHS Trust, which we still think is probably the best example of an integrated conflict management system in the UK. And one of the things that they did was they trained their managers in two things. So one was around difficult conversations. The other was around conflict, bullying and harassment in teams. So half day and 1 day training respectively. And I mean, when we did the research with them, one of the things we found was that those who, they trained about 70% of their managers at that point, those who'd received the training were statistically more confident in dealing with these sorts of issues than those who hadn't yet received the training. So it's quite clear that these sorts of training offers can have significant impacts on the ability of line managers to do the things that we all think they should be dealing with, and to do things in a much more informal way without the fear of this is going to escalate into a formal process. So I think, one of the things that kind of evidences how successful that was there was that their discipline and grievance rates, by around 2011, I think it was about 3 years after they started introducing this training, were around a fifth of other parts of the public sector. And there was also evidence of a big cultural shift in terms of moving to informal resolution and getting a more collaborative culture in place. So I think these things really do matter, and they can make a big difference.
I think just to come in briefly on that, one of the key things with the Northumbria case, and we'll send links to that particular piece of research in the sort of post-event email that we send around. However, one of the important things about that was also the fact that they trained all their managers. And one of the things that's coming out of the bit of the research that we're doing at the moment is that quite often line managers saying, well, I'd love to have those conversations, but I'm not getting any support from the manager above me. And you actually need to be training those managers as well. And A&A and Northumbria trained everybody. So they trained, they started with some more senior managers and they worked their way down rather than just giving it to the first line managers. And I think that's an important point in this. There's loads of, we could talk about this particular topic all day. Before we get on to the next point, I want to go back to our panel on, there is another question that I did want to raise. It's a really important point, I think, in this, which was from Liz Pulteney. Liz, are you still there? Are you around? Would you like to just raise the point that you raised a few minutes ago?
Yeah, I can do.
Yeah.
I think, I'm a HR professional, 20 odd years, and for most of that time I've dealt with trade unions. And I'm just very aware that when you do have recognised trade unions, a lot of how you resolve conflict is around that relationship and that partnership working that you've got with those trade unions. Some are really evolved and really want to work in partnership with you. Others just want to win and want to prove a point. So I'm really interested whether you include any trade unions in the research and how their feelings are around not just looking for the win, but looking for a true resolution.
Okay, would any of the panel want to chip in on this particular question? I think it's a really important question. Denise?
Yeah, I think in terms of collective disputes and talking about integrated conflict management systems, we tend to focus a lot on individual disputes, but actually, unions, I suppose the integrated conflict management systems or any innovations in conflict management may be viewed with a lot of skepticism by unions for fear of union substitution in some way. But I suppose there is evidence as well that when developing conflict management systems and involving unions with the design and consulting them, that actually it gives an opportunity to forge new relationships and to maybe establish new ways of doing things. So, you know, there might be an opportunity there. But I think, you know, in terms of our research that we looked at, with the help of the Workplace Relations Agency, there were certain disputes that were facilitated by the WRC, and that was kind of outside of the normal procedures as well, that then went on to like med-arb kind of mediation arbitration procedures, and that was quite innovative and a change from what was normally done with those case study organisations and unions. So certainly I think you need to, it's about involving the unions as well. It doesn't mean that this does not only is attached to individual disputes, certainly.
I think one of the things from our research that's come up in terms of trade unions is that what those organisations who have developed more integrated systems successfully, quite often that one of the key factors of that is that there is buy-in from trade union representatives, essentially, and building those relationships is really, really important. It's also quite interesting. Certainly, I think this would be certainly the case in some of the research that we did in sort of in the UK, was that one of the that quite often unionized organisations are more likely to develop integrated systems because there's an attempt. Because conflict is sometimes a more strategic, it's a more upfront issue in unionised organisations, but building that in partnership is critical. So Paul mentioned Northumbria Healthcare Trust. So they had a sort of an ongoing working party looking at conflict the whole time, and the trade unions were a central part of that. And it certainly wouldn't have worked without their cooperation.
I think the point that was just being made by the last speaker was really interesting around active conversation and active listening. It sounds terribly deliberate, doesn't it? But as a mechanism for dispute resolution, somewhere between informal, day-to-day preventative work and moving in towards mediation and discipline and grievance, if there was this kind of phase that we could create, which is around active listening and engagement and involving thinking and solution building and joint solutions in a different way. I think it'd be really interesting, because I think one of the problems with mediation, one of the perceived problems rather with mediation, is just the notion of bringing in a third party can actually be a deterrent for some people, on a, you know, whether that's both managers and participants.
Okay.
On it. So yeah. I've got a dog in the background, so I'm going to go on mute.
So we've got about the last 5 minutes now, and I wanted to come to each of our panel just with some sort of quick sort of takeaways, what they think organisations could do to move towards that sort of approach. So I don't know who would like to go first. If I pick on Denise, are you be prepared to?
Yeah, well, there's one thing I suppose we haven't really touched on, although Paul did mention it at the start, was kind of organisations often lack strong analysis of the data relating to conflict and conflict indicators. And I think that's maybe the first port of call, is to really understand what the organisation is facing in terms of the level of conflict and potentially the various outcomes as well. So it's I know there's a huge push for HR analytics and so on, and that's really a key aspect of this, is to understanding all those different conflict indicators, you know, in terms of absence, grievances, I can't even think now. Yeah. There's many, but you know, and bring them together to get a strong picture of what the conflict situation is, or the conflict climate is, and then using that as a preventative, proactive tool to intervene at the right time. So it's okay having line management training and so on, but how do you ensure that line management training is actually effective? And really we need to develop the right indicators to monitor.
And in some ways, that data can be used to make your your support or development of line managers much more focused, I guess, in terms of, if you have that data, where there's a problem, then you can put resources where they're going to have maximum effect. Paul, coming to you. You might like to develop that point, but I'll give you one more if you want one.
I was going to make exactly that point, so I won't labour it. But I do have a couple of other things that I was going to say. But I think kind of at the very top level, I think, and it kind of is a bit related, but I think plan for the culture that you have and the one that you aspire to. But I think be flexible, to kind of adapt a phrase that I've heard used quite often, frequently in a rather different context. No plan survives contact with organisational reality. And so I think be willing to be flexible in what you do and how you do it. And I think crucially develop the programme, as it were, incrementally and in partnership with the stakeholders, I think are the big takeaways for me.
Yeah, which comes back to the point that Liz was making about that trade union relationship as being one of those key stakeholders in unionised organisations.
Absolutely. That's how you get the trust. So, Jill,
could I come to you?
We really only allowed one.
No, you can have as many as you want, as long as you can do it in 2 minutes.
I'm going to go for a hard one, actually, a difficult one, which I think gets forgotten in the line management training and the mediation debate and so on. And that is how to organisations being mindful to address systemic problems in organisations. And I don't think, I wouldn't say any amount, but I don't think line management training is the solution to sort of embedded problems of misogyny, racism that we're seeing in bullying and harassment that we're seeing in some of the big institutions in this country. And I think it is part of the conflict management approach where the word strategy does come into play, that it needs to start at a different place in the organisation. And just 2 seconds, I was talking to one of our advisors, very nice being back in the office. One thing, you can talk to our own senior advisors yesterday about an organisation where she really was describing to me stripping back the organisation in order to deal with a big systemic issue. In that case, it was around bullying, and actually starting with a consultation with everyone and finding out where the problems lie and where the solutions might lie. I think those issues are systemic in a way, and until organisation can be seen to address them, then some of the smaller scale, in inverted commas, conflict won't be taken seriously. And finally, I did want to come back on the point about reps, which is, yes, we won't be surprised here, Acas hardwires reps into our research. And our case studies of the likes that you guys have done for us are like traditional in many ways, IR case studies, which are multifaceted, multi-party. And I think the bit that we're now missing is actually the employee voice in it. And I'm not convinced that some of the language that we've used today or some of the solutions actually have got the broad appeal that we'd like them to have to fully engage employees as well as their reps. So that's me.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a really challenging issue in terms of, the vast majority of workplace in the UK don't have any representatives, the vast majority of employees are not members of trade unions, and therefore there is a danger sometimes that the conflict management rhetoric is seen very much as something that is top-down, organisationally focused, and doesn't take those voices into account. I'm going to take chair's privilege and say just 2 things. First of all, create some alternative forms of voice, so somewhere where people can actually bypass traditional methods to raise concerns safely. And the second thing is, have some sort of body which brings all those stakeholders together that look at that data and triage your resources and identify where the problems are. Because if you're resource poor, which a lot of organizations are, that is one way that you can make that, you can get better value for money, if you like, from any of that investment. So building that information and then looking at those issues in a very strategic way, that in itself, I think, is very, very important. Thanks very much to our panel, to Gill, Denise and Paul for all their really valuable contributions today, and obviously all of the all of the delegates who've spoken and those of you who've just been listening and hopefully getting something from this session. As I said, we'd really love to know any stories of people taking some of the issues that we've developed in these sessions and actually putting them into practice in a way, and we might be getting in contact with you over the next few weeks. Thanks so much for coming today, and thanks so much for those of you. I know there's quite a few people who've been to most of our webinars. Thanks for sticking with us. I hope you've enjoyed it and got something to at least go away and think about. And hopefully, if we develop these, carry on developing these debates and discussions, we can start to improve workplaces for everybody. Okay, thanks very much indeed, and I hope you have a good day. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.